right, welcome back to the Fighter Pilot Professor. Happy New Year. I am your host, Meta. Glad you're here. And today we're going to be talking about New Year's resolutions and one of, in my opinion, the most important documents in U.S. foreign policy history. I know that you guys are all on the edge of your seat to know what this is. All right, we'll dive right in here in a second. But first, before we continue, hit the like button, follow me on Instagram and YouTube, Fighter Pilot Professor. Tell me about your friends, get them to follow me so we can keep getting bumped up on that algorithm and you can find me easier and other people can find me easier. And then they can like and follow me. All right, here we go. We'll jump right in. Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast. I'm your host, Meta. And in the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast, every week we examine world events and your daily life through the mind of a fighter pilot. The episodes answer your questions harnessing my experience in 25 years of flying fighter jets and my PhD in history, policy, and strategy. You can tune in wherever you find your favorite podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and on YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor. All right, so here we are in now 2025, and this year is some big anniversaries, and one of the biggest anniversaries, in my opinion, is we are at the 75th anniversary of NSC-68. And if you don't know what NSC-68 is, well, I don't blame you, because you're probably not a history nerd like me, or maybe you are and you still don't know, because frankly, it's a little, we'll say, obscure. But nevertheless, it is, in my opinion, one of the most important documents in U.S. national security and foreign policy history. In the National Security Council, NSC, document number 68, was written in 1950. It was published in April, signed out in April of 1950 during the Truman administration. And this document basically outlined the plan that the United States was going to use to combat the expansion of Soviet communism around the world. So let's dive into a little background here because, we got to have history background for new history. So, as you all know, World War II ended in 1945, and it basically left the Soviet Union and the United States as the two remaining superpowers in the world. The Soviets, of course, were pretty devastated at the end of the war. Their economy was crushed. They had lost millions of men and millions of citizens, shall we say. They had dismantled several of their factories and moved them to the eastern section of the country to get them away from the German invasion. And frankly, they had done the bulk of the heavy lifting during the war. Something like 70% of all German casualties during World War II occurred on the Eastern Front between the Soviets and the Germans. So, it was a hefty amount of fighting done on the Eastern Front. At the end of the war, as we've discussed before, that left Europe divided between the Soviet-controlled sphere and the Western democracy-controlled sphere, headed by the U.S., Great Britain, and France primarily. And for their part, the Soviets used the states that they occupied, such as Ukraine, Hungary, the former Czechoslovakia, and Romania, for example, as a buffer zone between the Central European states that had invaded them in the last 100 years, so namely Germany and France, and Moscow. So in order to successfully do this, they began installing communist governments in those countries, Hungary, etc., Romania, Yugoslavia, as discussed, right? Or made them part of the Soviet Union proper, like Lithuania and some of the Baltic states. So the problem is that while the United States recognized the expansive threat that the Soviet Union potentially possessed, we didn't really understand a whole lot about it, how it worked, or any of that kind of stuff. The United States had gone through a series of communist red scares in the 1920s, for example, when the Soviet Union first became a thing. But for the most part, the United States was largely unfamiliar with Soviet communism. That all changed in 1946 when a guy named George Kennan, who's a charge d'affaires to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, wrote what came to be known as the Long Telegram. And the Long Telegram was a telegram sent from the U.S. Embassy to the State Department and basically outlined Kennan's understanding of the Soviet Union and Soviet communism in particular. Arguably, at the time, Kennan was one of the, if not the leading expert on the Soviet Union and Soviet communism in the United States, and particularly in the United States government. And so basically he spelled out like what the Soviets, how the Soviets saw the world, how they expected things to go, what their intentions were, what their motivations were, how their economy worked, how the government worked, who, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You get this point. Some 8,000 plus words that he sent, sort of outlining all of this. It's an essay. Eventually, this was published as under the title of Mr. X. He published the majority of his long telegram in print in 1947. But this kind of sort of set the stage for, man, it turns out that the Soviets are way differently motivated than we are, and we are going to be in this ideological competition with them. And we kind of already knew this already, but this really confirmed it for sure. And then a series of events unfolded following that kind of just drove the point home. In the Greek Civil War in 1946, there was a large communist force contingent trying to overthrow the Greek government. There were communist contingents in Western Europe, in countries such as Italy, France, Western Germany, Germany in general, and others, Belgium, who were part of the government. And there was this sort of move between communist members and governments to sort of begin moving Western European governments towards communism. So this was sort of this growing unrest, this sort of growing seed of communism in Europe. And the United States supported Greece during the Greek Civil War, began to support Turkey in 1947. And then in 1948, of course, we roll out the Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe and shore up democratic governments in Europe. And then in 1948, the Berlin crisis happened, and this led to the Berlin airlift. We've talked about this a little bit before, but this is where the Soviets blocked off all road and railroad access and water access to East Berlin, and the United States, Great Britain, and France had to airlift supplies into Berlin. This was another thing that sort of solidified the idea that, hey, the Soviets are expansive and they mean business. On top of that, as all of this is going on, out in China, of course, the Chinese communists, with the support of the Soviet Union, are fighting against and winning against the Chinese nationalist government in China. Of course, the Communist Party in China is going to win this war in 1949, and China is going to become the China that we understand today, right, led by the CCP. So this all feels like this global conspiracy, if you will, for the Soviet-led communism to spread across the globe. On top of all of that, we're not finished yet. On top of all that, World War II, particularly World War I, yes, and World War II finished it, brought the end of European colonialism for the most part across Asia and Africa. So the French are going to get into a scrap with the Vietnamese communists. The British and the French are going to face opposition to their colonial occupations in Africa and Asia. Famously, the Israelis fight back against British occupation in the Middle East and eventually win their say as an independent state, and in 1948. And so what you see in all of this is there's a lot of tension between Western governments and these former colonial holdings, and the Soviets and communist agents writ large are moving to take advantage of that. So they're trying to plant communist seeds. They're supporting rebellion movements against these colonial occupiers. They're supporting communist governments as they try to spring up in these former colonial places. And so, like in the case of Vietnam, for example, perhaps most famously, we see this take place. We also see this take place in Korea, as well in 1950, so or in the post-Korean occupation, as we've discussed before, right? So all of this is kind of ongoing tension in the world, right? And the Truman administration doesn't really have a plan for facing it in a unified manner. And so that's what NSC-68 is. I'm not going to bore you with the details. It's about 60 pages long, but here's the gist of it. The concluding paragraph of NSC-68 says, to the effect, it says that the United States is going to use all of its economic, military, industrial, diplomatic power to support friends and allies around the world, to influence governments where it can, and to spread democracy through those mechanisms as much as it can. Effectively, it's a call to action for the United States. This is going to lead to the U.S. buildup of its forces, military forces, both at home and in places like Europe and Japan. It's going to lead to further injections of cash in Europe, and on the tails of the Marshall Plan, it's going to lead to a strong injection of cash into the Japanese rebuilding and occupation, and it's also going to lead to support for the government of South Korea during the Korean War and beyond. Right. It's also going to lead the United States to do some crazy stuff in Africa and Central America. We won't get into all of that right now, but right. This document, in other words, becomes the foundational document for how the United States is going to behave in the world. In strategy speak, we call it the ends, ways, means. Ends being our objectives, ways and means being the how and what we're going to use to do these things, right, to achieve these objectives. And so these ends, ways, mean, this ways and means is essentially what the NSC-68 spells out, is what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And in my opinion, why this document is so influential is because it becomes the real sort of glue that ties every U.S. administration together from the time of its writing in 1950 arguably until the end of the Cold War. This document is declassified in 1975, so here we are at the 50th anniversary of the declassification of this document, and so we have in a double anniversary for this document here. The last thing I'll say, which I think is interesting about this document, is that, in my opinion, you can arguably go through NSC-68, and you can Google it. It's publicly available. Just Google NSC-68, and you can pull out terms like Soviet Union and communism, and you can plug in Chinese Communist Party. You can plug in terrorism. You can plug in a lot of different things that the U.S. sees as its adversaries, and you can see how we behave towards them. We're going to use these mechanisms in order to assert our influence, control, and defeat these things that we see as adversaries to the United States. So I think that's the real sort of thing that that NSC-68 does. It doesn't just set out the plan for how we're going to defeat communism. It really informs the way the United States is going to engage in the world, no matter what it perceives as the threat. So there you go. I think that's what that's what NSC-68 is all about. It's an interesting document if you're into those sort of things. Hope you learned a little bit about it. As always, hit like and follow, and we'll switch topics here. Well, Happy New Year. I hope that you had a Merry Christmas and or Happy Hanukkah or whatever it is that you celebrate. And, welcome to I've Just Quit My Resolutions week. It's New Year's resolutions quitting week. And I will be, if it's not already obvious, I'll be frank, I'm not a huge fan of New Year's resolutions. And there's a few reasons why. The first one is usually we sort of overstep, and I'm guilty of this as much as anybody, but we sort of overstep when we set our New Year's resolutions. We set these huge goals, that are frankly unrealistic or unachievable in the time span that we expect to achieve them in. The second thing that we often do is we don't actually make any plan to achieve them, right? We don't set a specific goal of like, I want to do X by this date, and here's how I'm going to get there. We just say, I'm going to lose 20 pounds, or I'm going to learn to play the piano, or whatever it is. We don't really set an expectation for how or when or why we're going to achieve this thing, right? And third, we don't give ourselves a good plan to like ramp up to do it, right? You can't just go from like never working out to like working out every day at 100% and not expect to die, somewhere along the way. And then finally, we don't really give ourselves grace to experience those failures, to feel that muscle pain, or allow for the fact that, hey, this is a new thing that we're trying to learn. So what ends up happening is, around about, whatever day this is, second week of January or so, we're like, man, I am sore. This is hard. I don't like this anymore. I don't want to wake up at 5 a.m. or whatever it is that you're doing. I'm just not going to do that, right? And the sad part is because you're not giving yourself some grace to like, hey, I need a rest day today, right? Nor have you had the time to build up a habit because you made no mechanism for building up said habit or working up to the thing that you're trying to do. And like I said, since we're usually setting these big, gigantic goals, the things that we're trying to do are usually pretty hard. And that means that the path is hard and we're not giving ourselves some ramp up time to learn it. By the second week, you're toast. You're burned out, your body hurts, you're tired, your brain hurts, whatever it is that you're trying to do. And you're done. And you haven't built a habit pattern for actually doing it, right? It takes about, we'll say 21 days, right? But somewhere around a month, realistically, to like really get into the habit of doing something. So that's why I don't like New Year's resolutions, because they're, in my opinion, they're often like way too unrealistic. I think a much better approach is, and sure, like I'm all for like having a goal and being goal oriented. I think that's critical to like being successful in life. But you have to like set, as we've talked about before, like SMART goals, right? Specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time based. So those SMART goals, if I'm going to lose 20 pounds, all right, so by when are you going to lose 20 pounds? Because, I'm going to hide the names to protect the innocent, but I'm not going to lie. Like, I know a guy who like, man, I'm going to get stronger. He goes to the gym like one time, lifts a couple of weights, he gets on the scale and he's like, nah, it didn't really work. And he leaves. Like, that's not realistic, dude. Like, you got to set out a time frame for how this is going to work. So if you're going to lose 20 pounds or learn to play the piano, you better make that achievement of that 20-pound goal, or the learning to play, a sonata on the piano, like, that's going to be a hot minute, like a year from now. Maybe in 2026, I'll achieve that goal. Probably not in 2025, right? So let's be realistic about what we're talking about here. And, and if you're doing that SMART approach to goals, right, then you are able to like break them down into their component parts and achieve them, right? A book I like is called Atomic Habits, and it talks about like, small little changes eventually add up to big changes, but it also talks about, like the sort of atomic being both the tiny scale of small little changes and the large overall impact of the change, right? So it's both the small thing that you do every day and it adds up to this huge thing. So it's both like atom sized and atomic, like it blows up the world. So that's really the approach, is like, I have to know that small incremental changes, habitual small changes, setting my mind to do these things in this SMART goal setting way, is the way that I achieve these. So if you're at this place in New Year's resolution quitting week, don't quit just yet, right? Just reevaluate. Take a second, reevaluate your goal. Address it. Is it a SMART goal? Can I break it down into its component parts? And can I do it every day in order to build those habits to achieve my ends, right? So there you go. Hopefully you don't quit this week. Keep up the good work. I believe you can do it. As always, you can like and follow me on Instagram and YouTube, The Fighter Pilot Professor. Tell your friends. Have a good one.